Our session today will cover opportunities to extend your impact and reach through op-eds. These pieces require a special approach to be accepted and effective. So we have a couple of experts sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. With that, I'd like to welcome Karen Nichols-Rose from the News Media Relations Unit in the Office of Strategic Communications, as well as Lisa Pruitt, a professor of law at UC Davis. Just one note before I hand it over to them, and that is if you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A tool. Those questions will then be answered following today's presentation. So with that, Karen, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, AJ. And thank you, Lisa, for joining us today. We are going to run through, first I'll run through kind of how to prepare an op-ed for submission and how to think about an op-ed through a slide presentation. And with that, I will now try, oh, it advanced, yay. I was worried about this. Okay, so here's my first picture, and this is a template we use at Strategic Communications. And sometimes I replace the photos, but I like this one because I like to show you a nice, easy afternoon in the sun. And I want you to think about this because maybe you'd rather go do that than write an op-ed. It is, I like to say, not for wimps, but I'm glad you're here today because you're not a wimp. You want to learn how to do this. And it's something that we're going to show you how to do. And think about the best way to deliver your message, which always isn't an op-ed. Sometimes it might be a news release or a phone call, a pitch to a reporter that a communications professional on campus will help you with, and things like that. But if you want to still do an op-ed after seeing this horseback rider, we'll go on. Okay, so op-eds haven't been around that long. I went to journalism school in the 80s, and they were pretty new then, so new that my professor actually wrote the first opinion writing book for journalism students. And I had the big, thick, stapled one that wasn't published yet. Pretty funny. It's supposed to be the opposite, the editorial page. It doesn't mean opinion editorial, even though it's the opinion page. So don't say opinion editorial. Editors will know you don't know what you're talking about. It's the op-ed page, so it's opposite the editorial. You'll notice in today's papers, there's frequently not two opinion pages, though. They're kind of divided in half into an editorial written by the newspaper or a newspaper editor, and the bottom part, which is letters and maybe an opinion piece that's a syndicated column or a letter to the editor section. And it's supposed to give the alternative voice to a newspaper so that you're not just being lectured at, if you will, by the editors. So the first thing you should do, besides read your own opinion page that you want to submit to, or some opinion page, is you should go ahead and go to the publication that you're thinking about submitting to. This is an example of what the New York Times has. You just type in op-ed at the top of their website. And it says, this always makes me laugh. I think it says between 400 and 1,200 words. Okay. I'd lean towards 600, okay? That's most likely to get published. We have a professor on campus who frequently does longer than 1,000 words, but he's a well-known commodity. You'll see his piece later. His name's Greg Downs. He's a historian. And he gets published often, but it's often just on the online version and not in the paper version, which is not optimal. And then timing is everything. How often have we heard that? About a year ago, I got a submission from one of our faculty who wanted to put something out for Women's History Month, and it was the end of the month. And I said, too late. You need to do it sooner than that. So be thinking about it beforehand. And if you're reading this, excuse my eye itching, I had two faculty members in law and history, Greg Downs being one of them in history, who were writing the night of the insurrection. They were actually writing the afternoon because remember, we're on West Coast time. They sent me emails at about 3 and said, I'm working on something for X newspaper right now. Those are people that are on top of things and they get published, okay? And they're also known commodities who get asked to write things. I believe in Carlton Larson's case, he may have been asked to write that. Lisa, I'm not sure. All right, this is when we go for a ride. You're going to do it. Okay, so right here, I have a connection to the marketing toolbox, which basically lays out what I'm telling you here today in a more boring way. It has some op-ed examples, some conversation essay piece examples, and recent ones. And it has a basic format for writing an op-ed, which is just like the essays you learned to write in college, but you might have forgotten. And then you start writing. Okay, here we go. So this is an op-ed example that I worked on with the Graduate School of Management several years ago, and it was co-authored by the dean at that time. And the first thing you have to do is tell them right up front why they should care. This week, senior business executives will be doing something in 17 cities. As a reader, you go, I better know about that. I better know what's going on. I better read this, okay? Set the scene. Present the problem. The problem in this that was presented here is, and I'm only giving you pieces of this, is that there weren't enough women on corporate boards. And we know today this is still an issue, right? In the news, there's been bills about this. Women and minorities and all represented peoples are not represented. All underrepresented peoples are not represented. So this was to address that, and it got published, I forget where, actually. And give specific examples. If you're going to give your opinion and you're going to tell people what they should think, you better give some examples. So here's some samples. Okay, see how there's 3 numbers here in this one long paragraph. I don't want to ever see more than 3 numbers. People get lost in numbers. Don't put a lot of statistics in. The stats are not the story, like I say at the top there. Give some specific details. This could be, whatever flushes out those first few paragraphs. Details, qualifying facts. Okay, Williams-Sonoma has at least 1 woman on their board. Goody for them, okay? Give some examples of people who are doing their job. Then you have something good to say. Don't be a negative Nelly or a negative Norman. Say something that's good so that you haven't lost everyone who already disagrees with you, because you don't want to do that, right? Then you go on. This is big. You progress to the call for action. There has to be a call to action in every op-ed piece. I cannot emphasize this enough. You have to say, again, why should they care? So this is giving us a lot of evidence. And sometimes this has an emotion to it, like, oh, we must lead. We must help companies. We must do this. This is imperative for us to survive as a nation, One of my friends used to call this, one of my journalism school roommates used to say, this is the stand up and salute the flag moment. This is the reason you need to do this. What should we do? What are we going to do about it? Here, Graduate School of Management has the answer, right? That's your point there. Here's the call to action. We've gotten there. Let's go. We call on business leaders now, okay? You've talked about business leaders before. So this is where I'm telling you again, in an op-ed, you tell people where you're going. You tell them how to get there. You tell them where you've been, and then you tell them how to wrap it up and make it happen. Okay, and that's all there is to it. But the next time you read an op-ed in the newspaper, I bet you think of some of these things, okay? So now I have a shameless quote, okay? So I sent an op-ed that Greg Downs in History had written, and I showed him what I did to it. I took it apart, and that's what you'll see next. And I sent it to him, and he said, oh, I didn't realize I did that. Greg went to journalism school, by the way, and was a journalist, or maybe Anyway, he was a journalist, a print journalist. And he said, I didn't realize I do that, but I do that. And he says, right here, it's very important. Academics do not understand the call to action. And don't I know it every time I see it? And he's just saying, don't just eat your broccoli. You have, and say, you ought to know this. You have to tell them why they need to know it. And you need to tell them what to do with the information you just gave them. Okay. Let's say you've written everything down, you went by, and by the way, this very op-ed that I have up here is annotated on the website link that you'll be sent after this presentation. And I would suggest on your first op-ed or your first next op-ed, now that you know how they should be written, go side by side and look at the points that are made and how you're going to make them. It'll make it easier for you. Less wasted time, I hope, is my goal here for all of you. So have someone proofread it, run it through spell check, and have a friend read it, have your neighbor read it, have a student read it, see if they understand it. And think about, you know, what they tell you. And maybe it needs another transition, or maybe it needs less. Is the word count okay? On weekends, you can sometimes get by with an 800-word op-ed. San Francisco Chronicle rarely wants it to be over 400 or 600. I'm just telling you what they tell me. So you can always make it longer after you submit it. I'm gonna take a drink. And they might tell you to make it shorter. So remember that. While I'm here, I'll tell you, you write a headline on it, but don't count on it being kept. They'll write their own headline on it. So don't send a PDF. I know a lot of you like to do this. Please don't do that. They want something they can edit, and not all news organizations have an Adobe PDF editor. Or if they do, only the artists have it. They don't all have that. Trust me on that. Take your Word document or your Google document and paste it into an email to send it. Okay. And then include your bio, a very short one or two sentences, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And here's a trick I use. If you're not sure exactly who to write to, it is perfectly okay, if you haven't identified a person by name, to do the op-ed at. Every organization has, almost every organization has an op-ed at email. I think the LA Times one is op-ed with no hyphen, but it's op-ed at LA Times, New York Times, you know, NY Times, whatever. And those are good options because I worked at a newspaper for 10 years. There's something called the RIM, and it literally refers to the editors that sit around the big editors, and they read copy all day. And if somebody on the RIM picks up the op-ed and sees it and goes, hey, you know, we might want this, they'll tell the op-ed editor, and it's really faster. People think it's too generic, whatever. Also, don't be afraid of those forms that are on the newspaper sites and on the magazine sites. Use those forms, because you know what? That keeps it to the word limit also. And you put your bio just in the bottom there. Specify, this is important, specify that you'll wait 24 hours to hear from them, and then move on. Now, this sounds like a threat, but it's actually a way of getting information back quickly, because most of the time I find if they're going to reject it, they usually reject it pretty quick. And if they're going to accept it, they accept it pretty quick, but you don't want them to forget about you. I did have a situation recently where the San Francisco Chronicle took more than 3 days to get back to us. We thought we were done. I don't submit them for you. The professor has submitted it. I say we in the collective sense. And we had to, oops, don't get in this situation if you can possibly help it, withdraw our piece from the Mercury News, which luckily they hadn't read yet, and put it in the Chronicle because the Chronicle had accepted it. Whoa, didn't know that. That can happen. That can happen. But just check with them with a quick email saying, wonder if you're still interested. And this is where I point you to an additional resource. This is an awesome book that I recommend. It's written by the former opinion editor of the New York Times, and she's very funny. And on the website, the toolkit I sent you, there's a link to an audio interview with her on a radio station. I don't remember if it was an NPR affiliate or what, but it was really interesting. And I think you'll get a lot of information from that, and you'll get a laugh because you'll hear her talk about Sean Penn submitting an op-ed to her and all kinds of people who submitted op-eds to her. And, you know, the ones she immediately won't even read. That's good to know. Don't let that happen to you. And the ones that she knows she can read. So with that, I know we moved quickly, but I want to reserve time for Lisa and for questions later. So we're going to move to Lisa Pruitt, who has written many op-eds for representing the School of Law in her field. And she's also worked with an entity we don't just call it that, The Conversation. The Conversation, I want to tell you, because I don't know how many people know this, UCOP actually pays dues to them. It's really a donation. That doesn't mean they're any more likely or less likely to take your piece, but it's good to know, right? And that's an entity you actually pitch pieces to, and you do not write it beforehand, and she'll explain that to you. But they were actually invented in the continent of Africa when some of the countries there did not allow a free press. And this was a way for academics to get their word out on things without depending on, whoever to give the opinion, and not just allowing the government to give their opinion. It allowed academics to give their opinion. And so we've latched onto that, and she's going to tell you more about that in a minute. Oh, I forgot. I have another op-ed. Okay. Do we have time? Yes, we're okay on time. This was my reserve op-ed. Okay, so this is the op-ed I was telling you about that Greg Downs wrote overnight with his co-author at, I think she's from Northwestern. We'll find out when we go to the bottom. And this, I do the same thing too. I tell you 1,000 words, don't do that, but he gets by with it because he is a known commodity, and it went in the online version of the Washington Post. And here we have the same thing. He tells you what the problem is. Wednesday's assault on the Capitol. Then we have our country has a long history of this. So he gave an opinion that was slightly different than what other people gave. He didn't say, oh no, this is a terrible thing, this has never happened. He, as a historian, says, oh yeah, this has happened before. And then he goes into telling you how it happened. Get some basic facts in right here. If you're a lawyer, you might put some law in here, not too hard of law, but easy law. And Lisa can help me out with that. And some history here. Yeah, this happened in Lincoln's time, okay? And his piece was so interesting, actually, that TV reporters called later and interviewed him about this piece because it was different than what everyone else was saying. And then we have a little more of the details, add some more history here, yada, yada. Got some, I don't want to talk too much to this, but I just want to show you. And you might, again, do this with your next op-ed you try to write, just kind of see where you're going with it. Connect the past to the present. I like this part. He has the Civil War right below Senator Cruz. Okay, so he's bringing it. And, you know, in an academic paper, you would not do that. You would have them completely separate, but you're moving fast in this. It's a way of just moving fast. Think of it as an opinionated, if this helps you, an opinionated introduction to your academic paper. It's more like that. And look at this tiny bio he has at the bottom. Now we're at Lisa Pruitt. And Lisa, why don't you take over? And I can move the slide for you if you want. She has 2 slides that illustrate, this is one of her conversation pieces. And look, they put a big photo with it, and tell them how that's done.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks so much, AJ and Karen, for inviting me to participate in this. So I started writing op-eds 5 or 6 years ago after a long career thinking, I would never write an op-ed, but one of the reasons that I started doing it, to be perfectly frank, is that it seemed like the law school valued it when other people did it. And so I started looking for opportunities. And my first op-ed was published with the Austin American Statesman, I think 2015, and it was about a big abortion case coming out of Texas, and I had been writing about abortion issues. And so that kind of opened the door for me, and I've published a few since then. And then last year, early in the pandemic, I should pause and say that I write primarily about rural people and about working class whites. And so early in the pandemic, I was struck by the fact that trucking was getting so much attention, because suddenly we were seeing truckers as essential workers. And my father was a truck driver. And so I decided to write an op-ed about this. And so I consulted with Karen, I consulted with the terrific external relations folks at the law school, and we kind of brainstormed places that we could try to place it. But I was constantly, frequently admonished by Karen, it's very, very hard to get op-eds placed these days, because newspapers are failing and shrinking, and so there's just less and less space. Maybe an opportunity to get something online. So they were constantly managing my expectations, which I fully appreciated. And one of the options that Karen mentioned at that time is the conversation. And to be perfectly frank, I thought, well, that's not that interesting to me, because I didn't think it was prestigious. I didn't think people were reading it. And, but I did ultimately make a pitch to the conversation for this piece that I wanted to write about truckers, and to some extent about my father. And so in order to make this pitch, I had to provide information, kind of fill out a little profile on the conversation's website about what I do, what my expertise is, and so forth. And so I did that as a prelude to making the pitch. Well, the pitch was declined. And thankfully, I did get the piece published. Again, thanks to Karen and her terrific advice. It was published in Cal Matters on Father's Day. So Karen talked about finding a timing hook. And so we used the fact that I was writing about my father, who had been a trucker, and got it published on Father's Day. So there was a happy ending to the quest to get that op-ed published. Then in October, I was noticing that the new Hillbilly Elegy movie was about to come out, and I knew I wanted to write something about it. I had written about the book, had managed some fairly high-profile publications about the book, and so it seemed like a good idea to say something about the movie. And I was pitching around to the Los Angeles Times and various folks, and I really wasn't having much success, when lo and behold, an editor from The Conversation got in touch with me based on the profile I had completed back in April when I was trying to get the other piece published. So, in case the message isn't coming through, you want to go on The Conversation and you want to fill out this profile, even if you don't currently have an op-ed that you're working on, because something could come of it. So since it looked like it was going to be difficult to to get something placed in like the Los Angeles Times about this movie, I said, yeah, sure, I'll go with The Conversation. And it turned out to be a super, super positive experience for a couple of reasons. One was that working with an editor, as I hope many of you know, can actually be a really positive thing. So when I have written and published op-eds in the past, really it was just down to me to, to put it in that box that, Karen, to follow that format that Karen has described. Now, I got help from people like Karen and Carla and Kelly and their predecessors in the law school. But really, it's enormously helpful, actually, to work with these editors. So I've now worked with two editors at The Conversation. The first one was on this piece, and that was I forget exactly what his department was, the arts and culture editor, I think. And he was just a really, really fantastic editor. So I enjoyed the back and forth process. admittedly, I didn't enjoy every little bit of it, but it was a very constructive process. And then it turns out this piece has been read 80,000 times. It got picked up by Salon. It got picked up in the Chicago Tribune. So this is something important to know about the conversation that I had really discounted back when Karen was initially trying to get me to write for the conversation, is that their work, it basically becomes, Creative Commons. So anybody can pick it up. And so a lot of different outlets picked this piece up. And like I said, it's been read a lot. At about the same time, a colleague at the University of South Carolina who, like me, writes about rural issues, proposed a joint piece for the conversation with also a woman who is a law professor at the University of Nebraska. So three of us made a pitch to, I don't remember what that editor's department was, but she's basically the person who does rural issues for the conversation, although that's not in her title. So we made a pitch to her and she was very interested and very helpful. We wrote the piece. We had the piece finished by, I want to say, December 15th. And if you want to go back to that prior screen, Karen, it's the other screen. Yeah. So our piece was 5 Ways Biden Can Help Rural America Thrive and Bridge the Rural-Urban Divide. And so this was a much more policy-focused piece, as you can imagine. And our idea was, probably obviously, well, we've got this new president. What do rural Americans and rural communities need from him? And so we knew there was going to be this wide window of opportunity, to get it published probably in January before the inauguration. It turned out with we basically had this thing put to bed by, sort of finalized. We thought it was finalized by certainly, December 15th, December 20th. And then it was just this long, waiting period for them to, find a space for it. And I think they were trying to get close to the inauguration. And then the Capitol insurrection occurred. And so all the news cycles got hijacked for a few more weeks. And they wound up publishing it the day after the inauguration, which was really fantastic timing. And so this piece too garnered a lot of attention. It's been read about 40,000 times. It got picked up in some of the same venues that the other one had, the Houston Chronicle. I think the St. Louis Post-Dispatch picked up both of them. And so a lot of papers picked it up. It also got picked up, well, they both got picked up by an outlet that probably won't mean much to people other than me, but it's called the Daily Yonder, and they've been generating news about rural issues for 12, 13 years. And it actually, that in turn attracts attention. So for example, a Politico reporter got in touch with me after she read my work in the Daily Yonder, and she's invited me to write for Politico. So lots of good opportunities have spun out of this. Sorry, I'm bragging now, but one other great uptake on this one was it got picked up in the Aspen Institute's 5 Big Ideas of the Day a few days after it was published. So in case you can't tell, I'm really sold on the conversation as a publication venue, because you get to work with really smart editors. And yes, you sometimes have to adjust what you want to say to, what they want to say. Although I didn't feel at any time, I haven't felt at any time that, my independent ideas have not gotten through and not been welcomed. And again, one of the things that's been really super is just how much traction and kind of, the legs that they've gotten to be seen in other, really across the country. So Karen, if you want to stop sharing, I will try to show everybody my dashboard. Whoops, well, let's see. Maybe this is going to work, maybe not.
You know what? Let me further assist here.
Okay. I thought I had this all good to go, but
I know what you mean. I took down, I still had in background, so maybe that might have made a difference. So I took down my slideshow entirely. We can't go back now.
Okay, that's good. We don't need to go back. Anyway, we'll see if we can get to this or not. But the bottom line is that you will have an author dashboard with the conversation, and you can go to that dashboard at any time and see how many readers you've had. You can see the links to what you've written in the past, and you can see who, what are the publication venues that have picked up your work. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. And that's something I hadn't had before. It's kind of like, we use these various websites to, post our academic work, and we know how many downloads we get, and we know how many citations and so forth. But with op-eds, I had never had this opportunity until working with the conversation to see actually where, who was picking up my work, and, the readers and so forth. The other thing they do, which is, can be good, can be bad, is you will get an email, or you can sign up to get an email notifying you of every comment that is made on your piece on the Conversations website. That doesn't extend to the other publication venues that pick it up. So anyway, I'm going to declare myself a failure on the dashboard. So what you will have to do is go to the Conversation as an academic, and create your own profile, and then you'll be able to go to your dashboard anytime. And once you start publishing with them, you'll be able to have a track record of how many readers and where your work has been published. So.
And Lisa, you also had a piece published that the piece about the truck driver was actually came about because you were working on a book, right?
Right. So I was looking for opportunities, because my book is about what are the political lessons we can learn from the trajectory of someone like me, who grew up working class and is now in the chattering classes, and, in an effort to sort of bridge the political divide that we're grappling with in the nation right now. So I was looking for opportunities all of this work, feeds into and is related to my book, and, therefore is an opportunity to build a platform, to promote to build an audience for the book ultimately.
While I've been in Zoom, I got a couple conversation emails. They send me emails, ladies and gentlemen. They send me emails asking for experts in certain things to pitch ideas. And I don't think you get those, right, Lisa?
No.
Yeah, the people in my business, some of us get those, and I send them out to and they have deadlines, and so sometimes professors can't make them. But I send out those pitches quite often, and they often result in very good results. And the dean of the law school, Kevin Johnson, had a piece last week on the alien term, published in the Conversation. So he's a frequent contributor. And one time, I'll be frank with you, he had a disagreement with them. They had a misunderstanding on deadline, and he was very upset. But it's all okay now. They made up. And now he's contributing again. He just took a couple months off, but he contributes all the time there also. And many of the law professors do, and many professors across campus do. I believe someone who signed up for this class is due to have one soon. If he's on here, I won't say his name, but I believe he had a successful pitch that we worked on together. So Lisa, that was a great way to explain. You too can write for the Conversation. So I think we're at a point where we can take questions. And Michelle Villagomez, my student intern, who is a communications major and art history major, imagine that, communication and art history. She can communicate about art history, which not everyone can. And she writes our arts blog for us, and she is taking the Q&As today. So she's going to look at all your questions. And so if there's repeats, she can forward the questions this way. And shall we begin on that?
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, everyone. So I know, first of all, a couple people had questions about accessing links and the slides, which I said that we will send them at the end of this event. But first, beginning with Britt's question, Britt said, I imagine that authors who have not submitted op-eds and are not known commodities will not have the same kind of pull with these news outlets. Is there a hierarchy of submission or news food chain that newer authors should consider when looking for opportunities to submit their pieces?
That is a very good question. A lot of it, I'm going to say right off the top, is not known commodity so much as it is timing. So Greg Downs was not a known commodity in California yet. He came from another university when some of the citizenry tore down a bunch of statues in Golden Gate Park. You may remember about 6 months ago. And he was very upset about this because he felt like they were tearing down statues that had nothing to do with, they were tearing down statues that, in his opinion, had nothing to do with what they were upset about. They were just tearing down statues. And he thought that more thought should have been given to that. Now, there were faculty who disagreed with him, which is part of being a faculty member, right? So he called me Saturday morning. They had been torn down Friday night. He called me Saturday morning and I said, let's try it. So that's the one, by the way, that took 3 or 4 days. But the Chronicle took it and they published it, and they did the same thing as another law professor this week, where they ran it online, but they promoted it in their print version, which is at the best of both worlds. And that piece had a lot of legs because people wanted to read about that event in something besides a news story. And it was covered, that was one of the main teardowns of statues that happened. So that was a really good entree for him. And now he writes for the Chronicle all the time. Now, there's another issue in that if you're writing about something that's timely and no one else is really writing about it. Like I had somebody who wanted to write about, it was some agricultural thing, rice supplies or something. And the Rice Commission was writing about it. So they don't care if a UC Davis professor is writing about it. But if you bring something unique to the table and you have a nice piece that's nicely written that they can adapt right away. I forgot to mention, I think, that you must agree, there's usually an email that comes back to you when you submit an op-ed, that you must agree that that's exclusive to them. You cannot double submit or you'll be put on the bad list, I'm going to call it. And I actually had that happen with a faculty member on the Hill, with the Hill. They, withdrew after the Hill had already edited the piece and everything, and because they got a better offer. And I'm afraid that both I and that faculty member have not been able to get as much put in the Hill, which is too bad. So you need to be judicious on this. And I know I'm going off a little, but I wanted to make that point clear while I had the chance. Another thing I forgot to mention is that many op-eds, I used to go through and eliminate all the hyperlinks and the footnotes. Please don't put footnotes in it, but hyperlinks too. And now I don't. I leave them in because if your piece is published online, they frequently want hyperlinks in there to your studies or a news release or another story. And the Hill in particular is crazy for links. They will send it back to you and ask for more links. So it's easier to get rid of links than it is to put them in later when you're busy and trying to teach class and finish a book. So go ahead and put links in. We can always, you can always decide later to take them out or just make a note. If you want to take these links out, I'm good with it.
Karen, I was just going to add to that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, with the conversation there, I tend to write with a lot of links when I write op-eds because, usually it's going to be online. And there were, issues where they wanted even more links, right? Because links become the way that you provide substantiation, for claims. It's, here's your source. And on the, one bite at the apple at a time issue, I was just going to say with my first op-ed, We knew that we were going to be better off placing it in a Texas paper because we were, really focused on this Fifth Circuit decision out of Texas. And so that was kind of, our universe of outlets that we started with. And we tried, Pamela Wu was the external relations person at the law school at the time, and she knew someone at the Dallas Morning News, and she said, let's try the Dallas Morning News. We didn't hear anything back in 24 hours, so we went to the Austin American-Statesman. And interestingly, the way I found out that, that the Statesman had published it is I started getting hate emails from people who had read it. The Statesman didn't even tell me that they were running it, but suddenly it was running.
Now that's wrong. That's bad.
Yeah. So it happened, but it happens. So
But yeah. And go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, but I was just, kind of trying to illustrate the food chain. I mean, sometimes your piece is going to have a kind of natural geographic audience like that one did. And so that's going to kind of dictate where you start. I mean, I notice that a lot of, a fair number of my colleagues' op-eds wind up in the Sacramento Bee. I don't think they start at the Sacramento Bee. I think most of them start with other California papers, but they wind up in the Bee, and that's great, right? Because once you've written one of these things, you just want someone to read it because it is time consuming. And, we write these because we feel we have something significant to say. So.
And there's also just the opinion pages are shrinking. There's not a lot of room for this. And if you read the New York Times editor's book, or if you just read the New York Times opinion, how to submit an op-ed, they get hundreds a day. So don't be offended. Just keep moving. And yeah, sometimes there is a hierarchy. There are known commodities in this business, and I think Greg Downs is one of them when it comes to history. So are a few others. There's law, there's people in law that are well known too. So I hope that helps you.
Awesome. Thank you, both of you, for that. Susie is asking, are there bright lines about advocacy that we need to keep in mind as university employees as we give our opinions? And then Susie goes on to assume that they can't advocate for a specific bill, but just give information instead.
Yes, and I always have to check. It varies by issue. Yeah, it's usually just issue oriented. We've had, for example, a lot of people on campus have written about immigration issues, and they just write about immigration issues. They might mention a bill and say there's a bill right now, blah, 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 that addresses this. But you wouldn't say, everyone should vote for this bill. That's kind of government relations job. But always feel free to call my office and ask, because there's funny nuances about it. And in reality, you're probably not going to get in trouble, but it's good to keep these things in mind because you don't want it, you don't want to you're not representing the university. You're trying to illustrate your academic knowledge. Okay. Even though it says that you work at the university at the bottom of your bio. And then there's also quite a few people. There was someone this week actually who wrote, and he checked with me. He wrote a piece on behalf of his own personal issues with the school. And we just went over the parameters, and he was great with it. And it published, and it has nothing to do with UC Davis.
Yeah, so kind of in line with like the university, Anne Marie asked, do you have to be affiliated with the university to submit to the conversation? What if they want to write in a personal capacity, such as voting rights or climate change?
That's a good question. One thing that's funny is in the conversation, you do have, I should mention this, you have to be a PhD unless you're a law professor. They don't want students writing for them. I did one time get them to accept a law student's piece many years ago when I explained that, she was working toward a Juris Doctorate degree, and that yeah, she was being assisted by I think we had to co-byline with the professor. Was that you, Lisa, or was it another professor? No.
No, it wasn't me, but I was thinking about that recently when I had the student op-ed, and I have a few more student op-eds, by the way, in the pipeline. So maybe we will be talking about that. But I wondered if a co-authorship would do the trick with the conversation. So maybe that's something we'll try with my students turning out op-eds.
You could ask the conversation about whether you're just representing, you ask them about that. I don't really know what their rules are, and they certainly will answer that question if you go to their website. And they have a frequently
Okay.
asked questions up there too.
Awesome. And then Mike has a question that got upvoted 3 times, and they said, can you talk about the pros and cons of writing a blog post versus an op-ed? And how do you think about which one would be the best or the appropriate avenue?
Well, a blog post is really that's a good point. Blogs are different. Blogs are, blogs take all forms, don't they? We all read them. Kind of depends on if you have a following already, or if you're using a blog that someone else already writes. It can be very good. We have something called the Egghead blog on campus that's edited by Andy Fell, and he will put research in the Egghead blog, as it sounds, that is kind of eggheady and not a news release type thing. It has more jargon in it. And it has an excellent following, and he sometimes covers research for people. They don't usually write it for the blog itself. And I have an arts blog, and I put things in there sometimes that other people are doing. And occasionally people write for the arts blog. So if any of you out there have a topic you want to write about in the arts, doesn't have to be UC Davis Arts, I invite you to submit a blog piece. And we have about 2,000 readers a month on the arts blog. Not the biggest thing in the world, but probably more than you're going to do if you just make up a blog by yourself right now. It takes a while to get followings. Lisa, do you have something I know there's a lot of law professor blogs, and there's poli-sci blogs.
Yeah. So yeah, I see these as pretty distinct beasts. And I have actually had a blog since 2007, and it's a pretty active blog, and it's called Legal Ruralism. And on the semesters when I teach law and rural livelihoods, which I'm doing right now, my students blog with me. So right now, most of the content on that blog is being generated by students, which gives me a little bit of a breather from trying to feed the blog. But the blog is, it doesn't have a huge following at all, to be perfectly frank. And I see the blog's purpose as, it has drawn journalists to me after Trump was elected, and people were suddenly going, oh my gosh, there's a rural America and they're pissed off. We better find somebody who knows something about it. The blog actually was the reason that a Wall Street journalist called me. So I don't want to say the blogs are worthless. And I love my blog. It's kind of a repository of everything I've thought about rural for 13, 14 years. And I love the student writing, but it's not going to attract the sort of broad audience and that, an op-ed in a high profile venue, a big regional or national paper is. There are a lot of law professor blogs, and I have, in some instances, spent more time writing for them than I should have. But law professors read the law professor blogs, I guess. And so again, you can write to a particular audience, but if you're doing that because you're writing to other law professors, it is more jargony and so forth and so on. So the difference with an op-ed is you're reaching more of a broad, hopefully, well-informed lay audience, not an audience of lawyers and so forth. So the big difference with the audience, blogging can be very casual. That's one reason I feel comfortable doing it, because I don't hold myself to a terribly high standard when I'm writing for legal ruralism. Obviously, editors are going to hold me to a high standard. They're going to hold all of us to a high standard when we're, writing an op-ed. So it's a whole different experience.
And I would add our climate blog that the campus has a huge following. And that came about partly because of the Trump administration, because they took down all climate research from all of their portals. And so we positioned ourselves to become a good search engine place to go. And so that brings me to search engines. A lot of things, like Lisa said, she was found on her blog. That's because reporters are online all the time searching for who to talk to. And that goes back to the beginning of my presentation when I said, sometimes maybe you need someone like me, someone in your department, to help you pitch a story rather than an op-ed. And I have some faculty I talked to last week who have a book coming out on race issues. And I said, that's a good conversation piece as well as a book, that we could work that into the conversation. And the conversation had already said a long time ago, their editor that was putting something together for Black History Month, that he was interested in hearing more about the book. So, there's a blog meets conversation meets book, type thing, because we have a books blog also where we put faculty books in. So all options are good for getting your word out. It's just a matter of what direction you want to go.
Yeah, and maybe this was already, you kind of just responded to it, but Emily was wondering about if it's possible to use an op-ed or an article in the conversation to promote an upcoming book, even if the book isn't directly related to a current new issue.
Yeah, I'd say that's a big depends. So you can write a pitch for the conversation and say, look, I can write about this topic. And then they'll get back to you one way or another and say, well, we're not interested in this part of your pitch, but we're kind of interested in that part of your pitch, and tell me more about your book. There's all kinds of possibilities with that. I'd be interested in finding out more about what you wanted to write, but I think that is definitely possible. The nice thing is there's not as much time investment in the outset in the conversation. How many people out there, I know you can't tell me because we have you on mute, but have written op-eds that never went anywhere. And with the conversation, you can write 3 sentences or 4 sentences and formulate a good pitch for them. And then you hear back and you know whether to pursue it or not.
Yeah, and Ross had another general question, which was, how readily can one place an op-ed without having contacts with the journal or newspaper?
Well, the first thing to do is look up who the contact is, but I blind note, and I encourage faculty to blind email people we don't know all the time, because you know what? Those people change all the time. The San Francisco Chronicle and the San Jose Mercury News have had the same opinion editor for years. I have worked in this industry for more than 20 years, and those people have been the same for a long time. But the Bee changes every couple of years. The Bee just got an assistant opinion editor. They only publish a couple of outside opinions a week now because they don't have much space there. But there's also lesser included. One time I had a very rural agricultural theme, and I went to the Fresno Bee instead of the Sacramento Bee. And even though they're all owned by the same company, they have different editors sometimes who will consider. And it was by a student in vet med who was from the Fresno area. So, there's just different ways, like Lisa talked about Texas, and I didn't know that editor from Adam. I don't know most of these people, and yet I'll help people submit because their names are up there. You don't necessarily have to know. If you know someone, sometimes they'll ask you. And I think Greg Downs and Carlton Larson and Kevin Johnson and now Lisa Pruitt and lots of other people are kind of in that category where they get asked.
And then the last 2 questions are pretty specific, but Ajith asked, are there opportunities in air quality or measuring air pollution using low-cost sensors? And they go on to say, we just had a letter to the editor accepted at the Journal of Air and Waste Management Association.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Kat Curlin is our person on the media relations team in Stratcom, who deals with all climate-oriented things, and she could probably be the best one to help you. She might come back to me and ask me about it, but I think I would start with Kat. I kind of do a lot of the opinion piece venting in our office, and that's something I'll tell you. I'm not going to write an op-ed for you. I'm not even probably going to edit. I'll edit it a little. Sometimes I edit, Lisa, but I don't have time. I represent lots of different entities on campus, and I write news releases for them. And in February, I wrote 11 news releases and 11 blogs. I don't have time to write somebody's op-ed, but I am knowledgeable about that field, and I'm willing to give you as much help either on an email or a phone call as possible. And so are other people in my office. One thing we like to know is if you're submitting an op-ed, because if you're submitting an op-ed to the New York Times or to the LA Times or to the Austin American-Statesman or Fresno Bee, I'd kind of like to know in case I'm helping someone else with an op-ed right now, so that we're not flooding the same editor, because that's a good way to get on the nuisance list. Another thing, Cal Matters, which Lisa mentioned, is a really good venue. They ask us to write op-eds sometimes. And they have the editor that used to be the opinion editor at the Sacramento Bee, Gary Reed. So they've been a good venue for us. And they're a miniature version of the conversation in some ways, because they place their stuff throughout California, and it ends up in Napa and Oakland and all kinds of other newspapers.
Just going to jump in with another idea. This really goes more to the prior question about placing an op-ed without a contact. I've had an interesting experience recently of connecting with Sewell Chan, who is an editor at the Los Angeles Times, on Twitter. He started following me on Twitter a year ago, and I follow him. And then a month or so ago, he initiated a private conversation. So now I feel, and I'm like, oh, I've pitched some op-eds to the Los Angeles Times, and, I'll be doing it again. And so you can use social media to build these relationships. Do I think that there's any guarantee that Sewell Chan would publish my op-ed just because we're Twitter buddies? No, but, it may get the next time I submit to the Los Angeles Times, it may garner a little bit more attention to what the message I'm trying to get out.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And Patricia said that they work for the UCANR, and they have a webinar series upcoming. That subject is crucial to the area in which we live in, and they would like to know one of the academics to I would like one of the academics to write an op-ed that I can shop around to raise awareness of the matter. And is this a viable plan?
Yes. It is. Interesting to know more about it. And your communications person at ANR is a good friend of mine, Linda Forbes.
Okay, and
She used to work in our office.
Yeah, and that looks like the last of our questions.
Okay, it's 1:57. That's pretty good, huh, AJ? Thank you to the Office of Research for holding this. This has been a great venue. I've done this in small groups, in small rooms where I can walk around, and this was new for me, but we did it. Thank you, Lisa, so much for giving those real life, yes, I can do it stories.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you all. We adapt, right? But that was really good, insightful, valuable time spent. I did notice a couple of questions about sending out some of the links that were shared. And so what we'll do is we'll send an email. I'll talk to Karen about how we want to distribute this in terms of slides and links. But we will follow up and send that information to everybody that registered after the meeting.
I will tell you, if you go to the link, you probably don't need the slideshow, but but you can have it. Just don't use it and pretend you're me. My office might have something to say about that.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.